Hey, what's up everyone? It's Alice and I'm here today with another GRE video. So going along with some of the videos that I've been making lately with the writing portion, analytical writing, I wanted to walk you through an actual example of putting together an essay. This can often be really tough when you're going from just thinking about it to actually putting out the words. So what I'm gonna do is have this video as an introduction and brainstorming, and I will have another video where I fully write out an essay. And I'll actually have a third video where I go back, read the essay, correct my mistakes, and sort of point out the different things that I did or didn't do. Make sure you like and subscribe down below so you don't miss any of those videos, and information about the quantitative portion will be coming soon. Now, in case you've forgotten, I do have a video kind of explaining general tips on how to approach the analytical writing task, this one being analyze and issue. Make sure to watch it if you haven't already, but just to remind you, basically it will give you a question with two answer choices, typically A or B, and you have to write an essay picking which one of those positions you support. Now, you may not know this, but the ETS website, which is the organization that puts out the GRE, they actually have a full list of every single possible essay question on their website. I will link that down below in the pinned comment. And I wouldn't really recommend that you actually work through every single one of those unless you just have infinite time. But I would highly recommend looking through those so you get a really good feel of what all of these questions are like. Now let's talk about actually approaching the question. When you get to the writing portion, you want to make sure that you still read the question carefully. The general prompts are on the ETS website, the GRE website, but the exact wording may not be the same. You definitely want to just read over the question, make sure it's the right question, and make sure you understand exactly what it's asking for. You don't want to start writing or planning before you do that. And when it comes to planning, don't be afraid to spend a good amount of time doing it. You can spend 10 to 15 minutes even, and that just ensures that you can really flesh out your thoughts, make sure they're coherent, make sure your logic makes sense, so that when you actually start to write, everything flows very well, and you're not trying to make up logic on the spot. Don't forget also that you will have scratch paper. You have to use pencils, so for a pen user like me, that was a little bit of a thing, but use a scratch paper to your advantage. You do have an unlimited amount, so don't be afraid to go for it. And the last thing about tips is before you even start planning, you can just sort of sit, let your mind wander a little bit before you start writing things down, just to let your brain sort of begin to make all of those connections that it has. So now let's get into the actual question itself. The one that I've chosen for this particular essay is: to understand the most important characteristics of a society, one must study its major cities. Now pay attention to the instructions. Write a response in which you discuss the extent to which you agree or disagree with the statement and explain your reasoning for the position you take. In developing and supporting your position, you should consider ways in which the statement might or might not hold true and explain how these considerations shape your position. So you can see that actually right here, they're not looking for a black or white answer. They're looking for nuance. And what you want to do in the course of your writing is think about what those nuances are and how to explain them. Now, upon reading something like this, you may have pretty strong feelings one way or the other, but a lot of times you're just not. These are not really topics that people think about in their daily lives or that really impact you. So in that case, you can start planning and then just sort of decide which position seems to have the stronger evidence, or you can sort of arbitrarily pick the position that you think is going to be better. Now, again, keep in mind that the actual position itself is not that important. Before you begin brainstorming, also remember that your position can change. So anything that you start off with, you can always mold and make sure that is actually what you want to say. Here, in general, the two positions are agree or disagree. Now, you really don't want to just be straight down the middle unless you have really, really strong evidence for both agree and disagree, and you really can't reconcile the two. You'll also see that once you start to plan, once you start thinking about it, you'll find a lot of those nuances. And that means that when you're writing, you really do not want to use words like definitely, certainly, never. These words are extremely strong, and the only thing about them is that it only takes one point, one piece of evidence to discredit it. Instead, you really want to use words like most likely, in general, often. These words give you a lot of flexibility because you can say, well, 90% of the time this is true. However, I would understand if there was one or two exceptions. And in here, if you go back to the question one more time, it asks you for ways in which the statement may or may not hold true, and explain how these considerations shape your position. So you really want to be thinking about what those ways are and how it would make you agree or disagree more with the statement. So now into actually brainstorming and going through what I thought about it. So for this question, I actually wasn't really sure which position I was going to take. So when I went to brainstorm, I went ahead and sort of did everything, and I'll show you this PowerPoint just because it's easier to have something and let you all see what I was thinking. So what I did first was I wrote down a column for agree and a column for disagree. Now, thinking about why I would think that cities would be a good representation of a society, I said, well, most people live in cities. That's true for almost every single country, and you're basically studying the majority. Cities are also where you're going to find a lot of the culture and history. Now, I'm talking museums, I'm talking art, and these are real representations of what societies actually look like on the ground. So I think that if you're going to a city, that's really where you're going to understand all of these things. And if you're talking about how things work on a daily basis, of course, definitely cities are going to be your best bet. Most people, even if they live outside the cities, go into the cities for work, for life, for recreation, things like that. So if you're talking about industry, if you're talking about where people spend most of their time, it's going to be in the cities. And the last thing I came up with was modernity. In other words, where things are improving, changing, growing. And although things definitely change, grow in the rural areas, the cities are where you're going to see the big companies, you're going to see infrastructure, you see investments, all of those things happen in the cities. Now, when I was thinking about reasons to disagree with this statement, I actually thought there were a good number too. And the approach that I took on this was that it's not necessarily saying that cities are a bad choice for studying a society. The question is that the most important characteristics of a society must be seen through its cities. Now, I was thinking, what are the other ways to think about this? So, number one is different things that you can look at to understand a society. So, things like nature, mountains, canyons, national parks, things like that, the physical geography of a nation. You also have culture. Does that exist in a city? Yes, but can you find that in other places? Definitely yes as well. You also have government. Now, this isn't necessarily incompatible with a city because obviously governments typically run out of cities, but could studying the government directly outside of the city give you a better insight into what a society is like? You also have another perspective where the way that a society treats its most disadvantaged populations really reveals a lot about them. So these are ethnic minorities, economic minorities, people who just don't have a lot. How do countries treat these people in relation to everybody else? Because if you have money, if you have power, you can really take care of yourself. So what happens to those people who don't have any of those things? The next point is traditions. Now, this is another perspective that you can take where a lot of the traditional ceremonies, traditional dress, traditional foods, a lot of these things happen outside of cities or happen in very, very small cities. So Although most people are not going to be practicing these day to day, they do inform your current practices, Think about all the countries where the way that things are done historically still impacts the way that cities, transportation, everything like that is set up today. We also have this idea that cities are extremely complex. Looking at a city from the outset is going to be extremely difficult. There are too many things going on, and it would be difficult to really understand each of the different parts, kind of depending on what you mean by the most important characteristics. Now, the last point I have on here is that the population of cities doesn't necessarily represent the entire country. Now, again, this depends on what you want to study, but if you're focusing only on the biggest cities, this doesn't translate into the entire country. If you're looking at the US, for example, and you're only looking at New York City and LA, those are totally wildly different from anything that you're going to find in some of the smaller states in the middle of the country, for example. Now, the next thing that you want to think about is the nuance part of the question. Just to remind you, that was the ways that my position holds true or doesn't hold true, and how these considerations would shape my argument. So the first thing that I wanted to think about were confounders. I call them confounders just because it's a statistical term, but these are ideas, things that make you say except. So, for example, the size of the country. If you're looking at the US, for example, with a giant landmass, there's going to be a lot more diversity, there's going to be a lot more things that you could look at versus a very, very tiny country, a small one like Singapore, for example, which is very physically small. This could be something that potentially influences how much you agree or disagree with the statement. The next thing is the diversity. So in the US, again, that's where I'm from, so that's the example I'm using. But in the US, we have a lot of different ethnic groups. We have huge populations of immigrants. We have a huge physical country, which translates a lot into different regional views, regional accents, things like that. If you're talking about a more homogeneous country, being able to study a city could be a lot more representative. Now, the last thing I have on here is just previous or existing knowledge. So again, this depends a little bit on what you mean by understanding, but if you're talking about a personal understanding, maybe if you already know something about a country, you are really just trying to focus on all the things that you don't yet know. If you're looking from a more, let's say, academic standpoint, maybe you're trying to capture different perspectives, different ideas, so that could be a consideration as well. Going off of that, I have this idea of counterfactual. So I sort of mentioned those earlier in the disagree column, but by counterfactuals, I just mean other things that you could study instead. So in the case of understanding a society, potential places that you could look for information are, number one, people in power. So by this, I mean like government, I mean pop culture. I mean, if you're thinking about South Korea, for example, you're really thinking about K-pop, you're thinking about K-dramas. You're really not talking about what people are doing just walking on the street. That could definitely be an example of how you look at society. Another good one is media and news organizations. So it kind of depends on the country again, but media and news can really tell you what a society values, what's happening, what's being talked about, what's not being talked about, and that can reflect a society's values too. In addition to that, you can think from a very academic standpoint. You can think about experts, books, journal articles, things that they've written. And if you try to understand a society from that point of view, you can have facts, you can have very scientific thinking, and that can just be a totally different perspective. So out of all of these, you can see there are a lot of ways to approach this question. These are some examples of things that I thought about, but surely all of you can think of different ideas as well. Now, when I put those together into an actual essay, you'll sort of see that I have to cut everything down, and I spent a lot more time than you will have on the test thinking about all of these, which is why I have a lot of different ideas. But hopefully this gives you an idea of what the brainstorming process looks like, the different things that go through my mind, and how I approach a question. So in terms of brainstorming, these are a lot of the different things that you want to be thinking about. So you have the the things that you agree with, the things that you disagree with, and again, a lot of times they're going to be very, very similar or sort of at least the opposite. So you can say, I agree because this, or I disagree because this. And then you want to make sure all of those confounding variables are accounted for. So you can talk about the potential exceptions to each of the points that you mentioned. Now, hopefully this helped you out. Don't forget again that this is part of a 3-video series and that the rest of my channel has a lot of other GRE videos on it. If you enjoyed this, let me know in the comments below which question you'd like me to look at next. And thank you so much. Like and subscribe. I stream on Twitch as well, so if you want to come and ask me questions live, do that. But thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you again next time. Bye!